I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Today, Monday, January 19th, is a very bad day for Sean Diddy Combs. Not because something exploded publicly, not because a headline forced a response, not because anyone stood in front of cameras to deny anything. It's a bad day because something much quieter happened, without a trailer, without promotion, without explanation. Netflix released Part 2 of Sean Combs, The Reckoning, and the way it arrived is the first thing you're supposed to notice. When a story this heavy drops without noise, it isn't trying to entertain. It isn't chasing outrage. It's not built for casual viewers scrolling for something new. It's built to exist, to sit there, to be found by people who already understand what silence means. This didn't feel like a sequel. It felt like pressure being applied without touching anything. Back in December, when the first documentary dropped, most people believed they had just watched the full story. 4 carefully structured episodes, a clear arc, the rise of an empire, the controversies, the investigations. Footage filmed just days before everything shifted. It felt complete enough to move on from, and most people did. Statements slowed, conversations changed. Certain names went quiet. The industry adjusted the way it always does when attention spikes. It waited. But even then, something didn't feel finished. Scenes ended too early. Questions were raised and never returned to. Names appeared briefly, then vanished without context. At the time, those gaps were easy to excuse. Editing choices, legal boundaries, things that couldn't be shown yet. The kind of loose ends people assume time will eventually resolve. Part 2 exists to challenge that assumption. It doesn't reintroduce itself. It doesn't recap what you already saw. It doesn't explain why it exists. It assumes you remember December. And more importantly, it assumes you remember what didn't happen. There's no hand-holding here. No effort to catch up casual viewers. No attempt to make this accessible to someone discovering the story for the first time. That alone tells you who this release is really for. This isn't aimed at people looking for answers. It's aimed at people who are already paying attention. What makes this chapter unsettling isn't what it says out loud. It's what it refuses to say at all. Instead of dramatic narration or direct claims, the documentary slows everything down. It places moments next to each other and lets them sit. Clips that once felt isolated now feel connected. Conversations that once seemed harmless suddenly carry weight. Not because the documentary tells you they should, because your memory starts filling in the gaps on its own. And timing matters. This didn't drop during a quiet moment. It arrived while legal pressure still lingers, while civil matters continue quietly behind the scenes, while people who once spoke confidently are now choosing their words carefully or not speaking at all. Silence at this stage isn't neutral. It becomes part of the story. One of the first shifts you feel is where the camera chooses to stay. There's far less focus on public moments. No red carpets, no award shows, no polished interviews meant to reassure. Instead, attention drifts toward the in-between spaces, after parties, planning moments, conversations that happened just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. These aren't explosive scenes. That's why they usually get cut. But when they're placed next to each other across different years, they start to behave differently. The same faces appear in the same rooms. The same tone shows up in completely different situations. The same confidence remains even as circumstances change. Repetition like that doesn't feel accidental. What's especially effective is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown where people were, who else was present, how often certain configurations repeat. No conclusions are drawn on screen. But once events are stacked instead of spaced years apart, forgetting becomes difficult. Before we go any further, pause for a second and think about this. If something damaging exists and no one directly denies it, what does silence usually mean? And if you're already thinking ahead to Where this is going, make sure you're subscribed, because this story doesn't rush and it doesn't let go. There's also a noticeable emotional shift compared to the first documentary. The original release carried a sense of revelation. This one carries consequence. It feels colder, more restrained, almost resigned. Like the story has moved past outrage and entered the phase where reality settles quietly. Outrage burns fast. Records don't. Another detail that stands out is how little resistance this release has faced publicly. No aggressive attempts to shut it down. No loud legal counterattacks. Just carefully worded statements insisting narratives are being misunderstood. That response raises its own question. If nothing here holds weight, why not confront it directly? Why allow implication to linger instead of closing the loop? This chapter doesn't accuse, it reframes. It shows how narratives were managed publicly versus privately. What was said on record. What was handled off camera. How often those two worlds never fully aligned. It doesn't claim deception, it highlights separation. And separation creates space. Space allows plausible deniability. By the time you reach the middle of this chapter, something shifts. You're no longer watching to learn what happens next. You're watching to observe how people respond now that the room knows it's being watched. Reactions, or the lack of them, start to say more than any clip ever could. That's where this becomes dangerous. Not to individuals, but to systems. Systems that rely on time to soften edges. Systems that expect attention to move on before connections fully form. That expectation isn't holding the way it used to. Viewers aren't reacting emotionally anymore. They're watching structurally, comparing, replaying, noticing how explanations stop just before they become specific. Nothing here feels rushed, and that's intentional. Rushing invites mistakes. Patience invites observation. And observation doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. By the end of this chapter, one thing becomes clear without ever being stated. This story no longer needs new material to stay alive. It's feeding on what already exists, on what still hasn't been addressed. Silence stops functioning as a shield. It starts functioning as data. From here on, every move will be read differently. Not because anything new has been proven, but because the pattern is no longer hidden by distance or time. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. When the first release ended, it gave the impression of finality. Not because every question had been answered, but because the structure suggested it was time to move on. 4 episodes, a complete arc, enough information to believe the rest would settle naturally. That belief is exactly where this next stretch begins to apply pressure. Most people walked away in December thinking they'd seen what they needed to see. The rise, the controversies, the investigations, footage captured just days before everything shifted. It felt comprehensive enough to close the tab and let time do the rest. Time has a way of creating comfort like that, but comfort only works when moments stay separated. This chapter quietly removes that separation. Instead of introducing new revelations, it rearranges what already exists. Moments that once lived years apart are placed closer together. Statements that once felt confident are heard again, now echoed by careful silence later on. Nothing is reframed aggressively. Nothing is labeled. The documentary doesn't explain why this matters. It lets proximity do the work. As you watch, something subtle starts happening. Scenes you barely registered before begin to feel heavier. Not because they've changed, but because you're seeing them without the buffer of time. A casual remark from years ago sits next to a much later pause. An early certainty is followed by a careful non-answer. Alone, each moment felt explainable. Together, they start to feel deliberate. This is where the story stops moving forward and starts folding inward. There's no reintroduction here, no recap to ease you back in. It assumes you remember what you saw before, and more importantly, it assumes you remember what felt unfinished. That assumption isn't made for convenience. It's made because this chapter isn't interested in explaining the story again. It's interested in how it was handled. You begin noticing how often clarity seemed close, then drifted away. How engagement appeared briefly, then retreated. How responses arrived just long enough to acknowledge awareness, then disappeared before alignment was required. Not denial, not confrontation, distance. Distance that once felt reasonable, distance that now feels familiar. As the minutes pass, the pace slows further. The documentary allows silence to stretch. Not dramatic silence, familiar silence. The kind that once felt professional, measured, even responsible. Seen now in repetition, it starts to feel chosen, and choice changes how silence is read. Old footage doesn't feel archived anymore. It feels present. Statements you barely noticed the first time now carry weight simply because you're hearing them again, in sequence. Time, which once softened memory, is now sharpening it. This is where the viewer's role shifts without being announced. You're no longer watching to learn new facts. You're watching to observe behavior, how people speak when attention increases, how language tightens, how certainty gives way to careful phrasing, how engagement stops at the same pressure points again and again. Nothing here is rushed, and that restraint is intentional. Rushing invites reaction. Slowing down invites comparison. Comparison is where meaning forms without being declared. You also start to notice how little resistance this part faces publicly. No loud attempts to discredit it, no aggressive rebuttals, just carefully chosen words about misunderstanding and context. Those responses aren't challenged directly. They're allowed to sit, and when they sit next to everything else, they start to feel consistent. By now you may realize you're not waiting for a reveal anymore. You're waiting to see if the pattern breaks, if someone speaks when silence has been the norm, if clarity arrives where it's been avoided before. That moment doesn't come. Instead, the documentary leans into alignment. It places past and present closer together until distance stops working as protection. Years collapse into minutes. Memory stops being optional. Forgetting becomes difficult. By the end of this stretch, something becomes clear without ever being said out loud. The story you thought was complete never actually ended. It was paused. And now, with time compressed and responses aligned, it's continuing in a way that doesn't need volume to be felt. Not louder, not faster, just closer. At this point, something changes in how the story feels. Not suddenly, not loudly. It's more like a realization that settles in slowly, the kind you don't notice until it's already taken hold. The documentary stops behaving like a timeline. It no longer moves from past to present in a straight line. Instead, it starts circling the same moments, returning to familiar scenes, familiar voices, familiar spaces. Not to repeat information, but to change how it's processed. When moments are revisited without distance, they stop feeling historical. They start feeling current. This is where memory becomes active. Things you heard once and dismissed come back sounding different. A tone that felt confident before now feels rehearsed. A statement that once sounded complete now feels unfinished. Not because anything new is added, but because it's being heard again, under different weight. The documentary never tells you this is happening. It doesn't need to. You feel it in the pacing, in how long the camera stays, in how often a scene ends just before clarity would normally arrive, and that pattern starts to stand out. You begin noticing how often engagement appears briefly, then fades, how responses are offered just enough to acknowledge pressure, then pulled back before specificity becomes unavoidable. Not denial, not correction, delay. Delay that once felt reasonable, delay that now feels systematic. What makes this section unsettling is how ordinary everything looks. No dramatic confrontations, no explosive revelations, just familiar environments and familiar behavior repeating under slightly different conditions. The same calm tone, the same measured language, the same careful distance. Repetition doesn't accuse, it reveals. As the minutes pass, the documentary grows quieter. Not empty, but restrained. Silence stretches longer than expected. Pauses aren't filled. Moments aren't explained away. That silence starts to feel intentional, like a choice being made over and over again. And once silence is recognized as choice, it stops feeling neutral. Time behaves differently here. Years that once softened memory now sharpen it when placed side by side. Old interviews don't feel old. They feel unresolved. Statements you barely noticed before now sit heavier, simply because they haven't been followed by anything clearer since. This is where the story stops asking you to remember what happened. It asks you to notice how things were handled. You start watching posture instead of words. Who leans forward and who leans back? Who stays present just long enough to be seen, then disappears? Who speaks in generalities? Who avoids timelines? Who acknowledges concern but never consequence? Absence becomes information. Nothing in this section feels accidental, not because intent is stated, but because consistency removes randomness from the equation. When the same response appears across different years, different situations, different levels of scrutiny, coincidence becomes harder to rely on. The documentary doesn't draw that conclusion for you. It doesn't label anything. It simply lets the alignment exist long enough for your mind to recognize it. By now, you may realize you're no longer watching to find out what happens next. You're watching to see how people move now that the pattern is visible, how language shifts, how engagement tightens, how silence shows up at the same pressure points again and again. Nothing escalates here, and that's intentional. Escalation distracts. Stillness invites observation. Observation invites comparison, and comparison doesn't fade. As this part reaches its end, one thing becomes difficult to ignore. The story no longer needs new material to stay alive. It's being sustained by continuity, by repetition, by what remains unresolved. Silence is no longer a pause between moments. It's part of the structure. And once you see that, the story doesn't feel like it's unfolding anymore. It feels like it's settling into place, quietly, firmly, in a way that doesn't rush toward an ending, because it doesn't need one. By now, silence has stopped feeling like a gap. It feels placed. What's happening here isn't about what's being said anymore. It's about when nothing is said and how often that moment arrives at the same point in the story. This is where timing starts to matter more than content. The documentary doesn't announce this shift. It lets you discover it by staying still. Scenes unfold without urgency. Conversations end without resolution. Statements are offered broadly, then allowed to hang without follow-up. At first, it feels normal, professional, controlled, then it repeats. And repetition changes how restraint is read. This is where you start noticing that silence doesn't arrive randomly. It shows up right when specificity would force alignment, right when timelines would need to connect, right when clarity would stop multiple versions of the same story from existing at once. That's not absence. That's placement. What makes this section heavier is how ordinary everything looks. No chaos, no visible panic, just familiar behavior under familiar pressure. Language stays careful, tone stays measured, distance increases slightly, but never enough to feel dramatic. That's how systems protect themselves, not by reacting loudly, but by moving just enough to avoid leaving a trace. As the documentary continues, it pulls back from individuals and starts showing environments. Rooms, circles, shared spaces where the same rules seem to apply regardless of who's speaking. You begin to see how silence isn't just personal, it's cultural. The same restraint appears again and again, the same pauses, the same refusal to go beyond generalities. Nothing is corrected, nothing is clarified, and yet nothing is denied either. That middle ground is powerful. It allows stories to remain open-ended. It lets interpretation float without ever landing. For years, that space worked. It allowed time to soften memory. It allowed attention to drift. But time isn't behaving the same way here. Instead of creating distance, it's compressing moments. Years are folded together. Old interviews sit next to later silence. Early confidence echoes against careful phrasing. The documentary doesn't highlight these comparisons. It trusts that once you see them, you won't forget them. This is where behavior becomes more important than explanation. You start watching how often engagement stops just before it would become inconvenient. How responses are offered in theory but never located in practice. How accountability is acknowledged broadly but never placed specifically. Nothing false, nothing provable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of orchestrating anything. It doesn't need to. It shows how predictable the responses become once pressure is applied. Predictability removes randomness. It introduces expectation, and expectation is dangerous Because now, when silence arrives, it's noticed. When clarification doesn't come, it's logged. When distance increases, it's compared to every other time distance increased before. By this point, you're no longer reacting emotionally. You're observing structurally, measuring consistency, watching how posture holds even as circumstances change. You begin to realize something unsettling, that this approach didn't fail for years because it worked, not by convincing everyone, but by convincing enough people to move on. But moving on doesn't feel natural anymore. The audience has changed. It's slower now, more deliberate, less reactive. It doesn't need new drama to stay engaged. It stays because it's tracking continuity, and continuity is exactly what's on display. As this section closes, the pressure doesn't rise, it settles, it spreads. It stops coming from one direction and starts coming from everywhere at once. From memory, from comparison, from the expectation that something different might finally happen. It doesn't, and that becomes the point. From here on, every pause will feel deliberate. Every response will be measured. Every silence will carry weight it didn't before. Not because anything new has been proven, but because the structure is now visible. Once structure is visible, it doesn't disappear. It waits. At this stage, the documentary stops feeling like it's documenting events and starts feeling like it's studying behavior. Not what happened, not who was involved, but how people move once they believe the moment has passed. The camera lingers differently now. It doesn't chase public appearances or rehearse statements. It drifts toward the spaces between those moments, the places where control is assumed, not performed. Planning rooms, private conversations. The calm before and after attention arrives. These aren't scenes meant to shock. They're the kind of moments that usually get ignored because nothing dramatic happens in them. But when you see them repeated across years, across different levels of scrutiny, they start to carry weight. The same faces appear again, the same environments, the same tone, not identical circumstances, just familiar posture. What stands out is how confidence behaves over time. Early certainty doesn't disappear. It adjusts. It becomes more careful, more selective, less specific, not defensive, disciplined. That shift matters because discipline doesn't react. Discipline waits. The documentary never explains this out loud. It lets you notice how often language narrows as attention widens, how answers become shorter, how statements acknowledge concern without ever landing on clarity, how distance increases just enough to avoid creating new reference points. Reference points are dangerous. They invite comparison, and comparison is what this chapter quietly encourages. You start recognizing how often responses stop at the same place, right before timelines would need to line up, right before responsibility would need to be located, right before multiple versions of the story would have to exist in the same frame. That stopping point shows up again and again, not randomly, predictably. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of avoiding anything. It simply shows how often avoidance becomes the default response when engagement would narrow options. What makes this section unsettling is how normal it all looks. No chaos, no panic. Just measured behavior that's been practiced long enough to feel natural. Silence isn't treated as absence. It's treated as restraint, and restraint is rewarded. For a long time, that reward was distance. Distance from questions, distance from scrutiny, distance from consequences. But distance only works when moments stay separated. Here, separation is removed. Old footage sits beside newer silence. Statements once praised for their composure now feel incomplete when nothing follows them. Years that once softened memory now sharpen it when placed side by side. Time isn't erasing anything anymore. It's stacking. This is where the story widens beyond individuals. You start seeing how environments protect themselves, how proximity creates insulation, how shared silence becomes shared safety. No one needs to coordinate. The system already knows how to respond. Brief visibility when necessary, absence when useful, careful language always. The repetition removes coincidence from the equation. It doesn't prove intent. It reveals method. By now, you're not watching for revelations. You're watching for deviation, for someone to say something that doesn't fit, for a response that creates alignment instead of distance? It doesn't happen. And that consistency becomes louder than any accusation ever could. As this part comes to a close, the pressure feels different than before. It's no longer building towards something. It's surrounding it, coming from memory, from pattern, from the quiet understanding that nothing here needs to escalate to remain active. The story doesn't need new footage. It doesn't need a confession. It doesn't even need a response. It already has continuity, and once continuity is visible, it doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. It stays, it waits, and from this point forward, every move will be read against it, whether anyone wants it to be or not. By now, time has stopped doing what it used to do. It no longer softens memory. It no longer creates distance. It no longer allows moments to fade into context. Here, time starts behaving like evidence. The documentary doesn't announce this shift. It simply compresses everything. Years that once lived far apart are folded into the same space. Early confidence sits beside later caution. Statements once delivered without hesitation now echo against carefully chosen silence. Nothing has been altered. Nothing has been added. Only the distance has been removed. This is where forgetting becomes difficult. Old interviews don't feel historical anymore. They feel unfinished. Not because they were wrong, but because nothing ever followed them to completion. Words that once sounded final now feel provisional when you realize how often they were never built upon. You start noticing how often clarity was postponed instead of denied, how explanations were offered broadly, then left suspended, how engagement stopped just before timelines would need to connect. Delay becomes visible here, and delay when repeated stops feeling passive. The documentary allows long stretches to pass without commentary. It trusts silence to do the work. Not dramatic silence, but familiar silence. The kind that once felt controlled, professional, even reassuring. Seen now, it feels chosen. This is where restraint starts to lose its cover. Because restraint looks responsible until you see how often it prevents resolution, how often it arrives at the exact moment alignment would become unavoidable, how consistently it creates just enough space for multiple versions of the same story to exist without colliding. That space used to feel neutral. Now it feels strategic. The more you watch, the clearer it becomes that nothing here relies on shock. There are no moments designed to explode. Everything is measured, calm, repeated with precision across different years and circumstances. Precision like that isn't loud. It's practiced. You begin to recognize how often the same language appears regardless of situation, how tone remains steady even as scrutiny increases, how responses become shorter as attention grows sharper. This is behavior under observation. And behavior under observation always reveals more than content. By this point, the viewer's role has fully shifted. You're no longer consuming information. You're measuring consistency, watching how each response fits into a pattern that's already been revealed. Who speaks in generalities? Who avoids timelines? Who acknowledges concern but never consequence? Absence becomes data. Nothing in this section feels accidental. Not because intent is stated, but because repetition removes randomness. When the same approach appears across different eras, coincidence stops being convincing. The documentary doesn't tell you this. It lets you sit with it. Time continues to stack moments instead of separating them. Years that once diluted urgency now intensify it when viewed together. Questions that were postponed don't disappear. They resurface heavier, sharper, harder to ignore. This is where you realize something important. The story no longer needs to move forward to remain active. It's sustaining itself through what remains unresolved, through what still hasn't been addressed, through how often engagement stopped just short of clarity. Silence is no longer a pause between chapters. It's part of the structure. As this section closes, the pressure doesn't spike. It settles in deeper. It becomes steadier, less reactive, more permanent. Not waiting for a reveal, but waiting for something to break the pattern. Nothing does. And that's when it becomes clear. Time is no longer on anyone's side here. It isn't erasing. It isn't forgiving. It's stacking. And once time starts stacking instead of fading, the story doesn't need an ending to carry weight. It already has gravity. At this point, the emotional temperature of the story changes. Earlier, there was tension, curiosity, the feeling that something was unfolding. Now that energy fades into something colder, heavier, more restrained. This isn't the phase where people react. It's the phase where consequences begin to settle quietly. The documentary doesn't announce this shift. You feel it in the absence of urgency, in how nothing feels rushed anymore, in how outrage is no longer the engine driving attention. Outrage burns fast. Consequence doesn't. This section carries that weight. It feels less interested in exposing something new and more interested in letting reality sit where it already is. Like the story has crossed a line where denial doesn't need to be loud and defense doesn't need to be aggressive. Instead, everything becomes measured. You start noticing how carefully responses are managed now. Not just what's said, but how little is said. Statements grow shorter, appearances become rarer, language becomes safer. The closer scrutiny gets, the less specific everything becomes. That inversion is impossible to miss once you're looking for it. Normally, pressure forces clarity. Here, pressure produces distance. Not chaotic distance, controlled distance. The kind that signals awareness rather than panic. Panic reacts. Discipline waits. And discipline is what dominates this stretch. You begin seeing how engagement is calibrated. Who speaks publicly? Who lets others speak for them? Who maintains just enough presence to avoid absence, but never enough to create new points of reference? Reference points are dangerous when old ones are being re-examined. The documentary doesn't frame this as fear. It frames it as adjustment. A system recognizing that its old rhythm might no longer work the way it used to. That recognition is subtle, but it's everywhere. Older material starts behaving differently here. Interviews you've seen before feel altered. Not because the words changed, but because the context did. Confidence that once felt natural now feels rehearsed. Humor feels defensive. Certainty feels selective. Not false, selective. Selection controls the frame without controlling the facts. And control of the frame is where influence lives. This is also where the lens widens again. The story stops orbiting one figure or one moment and begins showing how environments respond collectively, how loyalty is activated, how proximity becomes insulation, how shared silence creates shared safety. No one is accused, nothing is declared. The structure speaks for itself. You start recognizing the rhythm, visibility when needed, absence when useful, statements that acknowledge emotion but avoid explanation. Over and over again, that repetition removes coincidence from the equation. By now, the viewer isn't reacting anymore. You're evaluating, measuring whether responses make sense given everything that's already been seen. And increasingly, they don't. The documentary leans into that discomfort. It allows scenes to end without closure, conversations to stop just before clarity. It doesn't fill the silence. It preserves it. Because silence, once contextualized, becomes information. You also begin noticing who remains comfortable, who continues moving forward unaffected, who maintains access, platforms, partnerships. Comfort under scrutiny isn't proof of anything. It's a signal. This part of the story isn't about collapse. It's about exposure of mechanics, how narratives are stabilized, how uncertainty is managed without ever being resolved, how influence operates quietly without raising its voice. The most unsettling realization arrives without drama, that this approach didn't survive for years by accident. It survived because it worked, not by convincing everyone, but by convincing enough people to move on. But moving on doesn't feel natural anymore. The audience has changed. It's slower, more deliberate, less reactive. It doesn't need constant stimulation to stay engaged. It stays because it's tracking consistency. And consistency is exactly what's being revealed. As this section comes to an end, the story feels different than it did at the start. It no longer feels like it belongs to the present moment. It feels like history being reorganized in real time. And once history starts reorganizing itself, silence stops being neutral. It starts being noticed. From here on, nothing will land the same way again. Not because of what comes next, but because of what's already been seen, aligned, and understood. The pressure isn't rising anymore. It's settling in. By now, the absence of resistance becomes impossible to ignore. Not because no one notices it, but because everyone does. There are no loud attempts to shut this down, no aggressive legal counteroffensive, no urgent campaign to reframe the narrative with force. What appears instead is something far quieter: carefully worded statements, controlled language, reassurances that things are being misunderstood. That response on its own might have felt reasonable once. Placed here, it feels deliberate. If nothing in this story carried weight, confrontation would be easy, denial would be direct, clarification would be specific. But instead, implication is allowed to linger. Questions are acknowledged without being answered. Distance is maintained without being explained. This chapter doesn't accuse anyone of avoiding the story. It shows how avoidance becomes a response. You begin noticing how often statements arrive just long enough to signal awareness, then stop short of resolution. How language stays broad enough to sound complete, yet vague enough to avoid follow-up. Nothing is false. Nothing is provable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. What's striking is how familiar this pattern feels once it's visible. You've seen it before, even if you didn't register it at the time. A brief acknowledgement, a measured tone, a pause, then distance. Distance that allows interpretation to float without ever landing. That distance used to feel neutral. Now it feels strategic. The documentary doesn't say this out loud. It doesn't need to. It places response next to response, across different years under different circumstances, and lets the rhythm speak for itself. The rhythm doesn't change. What changes is how it's read. This is where the viewer fully stops waiting for information and starts measuring behavior. Who speaks publicly? Who chooses silence? Who lets others speak on their behalf? Who disappears entirely? Absence becomes louder than presence. Nothing escalates here. No dramatic shift, just a tightening. Engagement becomes rarer. Appearances become more calculated. Language becomes safer. The closer scrutiny gets, the more general everything sounds. That inversion is revealing. Usually pressure forces specificity. Here, pressure produces restraint, not chaos, discipline. Discipline that knows when to step forward and when to step back. Discipline that avoids creating new reference points while old ones are being re-examined. Reference points are dangerous when alignment hasn't been achieved. This part also widens the lens again. It stops focusing on single figures and starts showing how environments respond collectively. How silence isn't isolated, it's shared. How restraint isn't personal, it's learned. Entire circles begin to move the same way. That consistency tells its own story. The documentary never claims coordination. It doesn't need to. It shows how predictability replaces randomness once pressure appears. Predictability introduces expectation, and expectation changes everything. Because now when a statement doesn't come, it's noticed. When clarification is avoided, it's logged. When engagement stops at the exact moment specificity would be required, it feels familiar. Too familiar. By this point, the story no longer feels like it's unfolding forward. It feels like it's revealing itself backward. Past moments rearrange in your mind. Old interviews feel heavier. Casual remarks feel less casual. Not because the words changed, because the frame did. What lands hardest here is the realization that no single moment needed to be explosive for this structure to exist. It was built quietly, maintained patiently, protected by time doing the work explanation never could. Until now. This section makes something clear without ever stating it. The audience isn't reacting anymore. They're auditing, comparing responses across years instead of moments, measuring consistency instead of intent. And once that shift happens, control becomes much harder to maintain because control depends on fragmentation, and fragmentation has just been removed. As this chapter settles, the pressure doesn't announce itself. It surrounds, it comes from memory, from alignment, from expectation, from the understanding that every future response will now be read against what's already been seen. Nothing new needs to happen for that weight to remain. It's already there, and it isn't going anywhere. By now, the story no longer feels centered on one person. Something wider has come into focus. The documentary begins pulling back, not to distance itself, but to reveal the environment surrounding everything you've already seen. The rooms, the circles, the systems that remain steady regardless of who's standing at the center at any given moment. This is where the narrative quietly shifts from individuals to structure. You start noticing how often pressure doesn't lead to resolution, but to recalibration, visibility when it's useful, absence when it's safer, statements that acknowledge concern without ever creating a record that can be revisited later. Over and over again, the same rhythm appears. That rhythm isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself, it just keeps working. The documentary doesn't suggest collapse, it suggests adaptation. Systems don't panic the way people do. They adjust, they refine, they become quieter, more indirect, more patient. You begin to see how loyalty operates in this space. Familiar faces reappear. Public alignment is emphasized. Unity becomes a message, not spoken directly, but displayed. Displays don't explain anything. They reassure. Reassurance is useful when explanation would raise more questions. This is also where proximity starts to matter more than statements. Who stays close? Who maintains access? Who continues moving forward unaffected? Comfort under scrutiny isn't proof of anything. It's a signal. The documentary never calls attention to it. It lets you notice how little seems to change for certain people even as attention intensifies. Platforms remain open. Partnerships continue. Distance is carefully managed, but not enough to disrupt momentum. That balance is intentional. What becomes clear is that this story isn't being managed moment to moment. It's being managed structurally. Attention is redirected. Uncertainty is softened. Conversations drift away from specifics toward broader values, misunderstandings, intentions. Anything that feels safe enough to say without creating alignment. Alignment is dangerous because alignment forces timelines to coexist. It forces stories that were once kept separate to sit side by side. And when that happens, inconsistencies stop hiding behind context. This section allows scenes to end without closure. Conversations stop just before clarity. Silence isn't filled, it's preserved. Preserved silence behaves differently. Once contextualized, it becomes information. You start recognizing how often crises were followed, not by answers, but by repositioning. A recalibrated presence, a carefully timed appearance, then distance again. The same sequence repeating under different lighting. That repetition removes coincidence from the equation. The audience's role changes again here. You're no longer evaluating events. You're evaluating responses, not asking whether something is true or false, but whether the response makes sense given everything that's already been seen. Increasingly, it doesn't. The documentary leans into that dissonance. It doesn't resolve it, it lets it sit. Because unresolved tension doesn't fade, it waits. This is the moment where attention fully shifts from reaction to observation. Viewers aren't chasing the next reveal. They're watching how the present responds to the past. Every move is read through that lens. And that lens doesn't reset. By now, it's clear the story doesn't need escalation to maintain pressure. It has continuity. Every resurfaced clip lands heavier. Every old quote feels different. Not because it's new, but because it's now part of a visible sequence. Sequence turns memory into evidence, and evidence doesn't argue. It accumulates. As this part settles, something fundamental has changed in how the story feels. It no longer belongs to the present moment. It feels like history being reorganized in real time. And once history starts reorganizing itself, silence stops being neutral. It starts being measured. From here on, every response will be compared. Every pause will feel deliberate. Every attempt to redirect will be weighed against everything that came before it. Not emotionally, structurally, and structure doesn't forget. By this point, something irreversible has already happened. The story no longer feels like it's moving toward a conclusion. It feels like it has crossed into a different phase, one where nothing needs to be revealed anymore for the pressure to keep building. What's driving everything now isn't information, it's expectation. The documentary stops asking the audience to believe anything. It doesn't need belief, it has alignment. Moments that were once scattered across years now exist in the same frame. Once that alignment happens, gravity takes over. You feel it in how carefully everything is handled now. Statements become shorter. Language becomes safer. Appearances become rarer. The closer scrutiny gets, the less specific responses become. That inversion is impossible to miss once you're paying attention. Normally, pressure forces clarity. Here, pressure produces restraint, not panic. Control. You begin noticing how engagement is managed with precision. Who speaks publicly? Who lets intermediaries speak instead? Who stays visible just enough to be acknowledged, but never enough to be pinned down? Nothing feels impulsive anymore. Everything feels rehearsed, and rehearsal only exists when outcomes are anticipated. This is where predictability becomes visible. You start anticipating responses before they happen. You can sense when silence is coming. You can feel when language will widen instead of narrow. And when those predictions are confirmed, something important shifts. Authority depends on surprise. Predictability reveals process. The documentary doesn't highlight this. It simply lets time collapse further. Older material starts behaving differently. Interviews you've seen before feel altered. Not because the words changed, but because the context did. Confidence that once felt natural now feels selective. Certainty feels edited. Humor feels defensive. Not false, controlled. Control doesn't deny anything. It waits. It relies on time to do the work explanation never could. But time isn't cooperating anymore. Instead of erasing, it's stacking. Every resurfaced clip becomes heavier. Every old quote lands differently. This is where the story sustains itself without movement. Nothing explodes, nothing escalates. And that's intentional. Explosions distract. Consistency convinces. You start realizing that the real tension now lives in what hasn't happened, in the statements that never came, in the clarifications that were avoided, in the engagement that stopped just before it would have created alignment. Completion is dangerous. Completion creates accountability. Accountability forces stories to coexist. The documentary understands this and leans into stillness. It allows scenes to end without resolution. It preserves silence instead of filling it. Because silence, once contextualized, becomes data. By now, the audience isn't waiting for answers. They're watching behavior under observation. Who grows quieter? Who stays comfortable? Who maintains access? Who recalibrates without explaining why? Comfort under scrutiny is its own signal. This part of the story isn't about collapse. It's about exposure of mechanics. How narratives are stabilized, how uncertainty is managed without ever being resolved, how systems protect themselves quietly. The most unsettling realization arrives without drama, that this approach didn't survive for decades because it was fragile. It survived because it worked. But something has changed. Attention hasn't moved on. It has matured. Viewers aren't reacting emotionally anymore. They're observing structurally, measuring consistency, tracking repetition, and that kind of attention doesn't burn out. It accumulates. As this section settles, it becomes clear that nothing needs to escalate for the weight to remain. The pressure isn't rising, it's surrounding. From here on, every move will feel heavier, every pause louder, every delay more noticeable. Not because anything new has been proven, but because the pattern is fully visible now. And once a pattern is seen clearly, it doesn't disappear. It waits. At this stage, the story stops asking for attention. It already has it. What changes now isn't the material. It's how every action is read, every pause, every appearance, every carefully chosen word. Nothing exists on its own anymore. Everything is compared. This is where silence becomes the loudest element in the room. Not silence as absence, but silence as decision. A decision to wait, to generalize, to avoid closing loops that would force alignment between past statements and present behavior. For a long time, that choice worked. Time softened memory. Distance diluted urgency. New headlines replaced old questions. But that mechanism has failed here. Instead of erasing, time has stacked. Old interviews resurface and land differently. Statements once praised for composure now feel incomplete. Casual remarks from years ago sit under a sharper light. Not because new facts were added, but because context finally caught up. That's the shift no clarification can undo. You begin noticing how often engagement stopped at the same moment clarity would have been required. How explanations expanded outward, but never downward. How responsibility was acknowledged broadly, but never located specifically. Nothing provable, nothing deniable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, repeated often enough, becomes a method. This is where the audience's role fully changes. You're no longer asking what happened. You're asking why the same response keeps happening the same way. Why silence appears at the same pressure points. Why language always widens instead of narrowing. Those questions don't demand answers to be effective. They demand awareness. And awareness is harder to outrun than doubt. The documentary doesn't point fingers. It doesn't raise its voice. It allows patterns to speak. Patterns don't argue. They repeat. And repetition has done most of the work already. By now you're watching behavior under sustained observation. Who remains comfortable? Who continues moving forward unaffected? Who maintains access, platforms, partnerships? Comfort under scrutiny isn't proof of anything. It's a signal. The story widens again here, quietly. It's no longer about a single figure or a single circle. It's about how environments preserve themselves, how loyalty is rewarded, how restraint is framed as maturity, how distance is praised as professionalism. For years, silence was treated as dignity. Seen now, it feels like deflection. That realization doesn't arrive with outrage. It arrives with clarity, the kind that settles in and doesn't leave, the kind that changes how every future moment is interpreted. This is where the documentary stops relying on content and starts relying on context. The context of how things were handled repeatedly, predictably, successfully. That success depended on one assumption: that attention would eventually move on. It hasn't. Instead, attention has slowed. It's steadier now, less reactive, more observant. It doesn't need new material to stay engaged. It feeds on continuity, and continuity is everywhere. As this part draws to a close, something becomes impossible to ignore. The story doesn't need to escalate to have consequences. It doesn't need a dramatic reveal or a final statement. It only needs memory. Memory that keeps comparing. Memory that keeps noticing. Memory that doesn't reset when a new project launches or a new narrative is introduced. From here on, every response will be read through that lens. Every silence will carry weight. Every delay will feel intentional. Not because anything new has been proven, but because nothing unresolved can hide behind time anymore. By the time the story reaches this point, something subtle but permanent has already taken place. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed overnight. No single moment arrived that wrapped everything up. And that's exactly why this ending matters more than any dramatic reveal ever could. What you're watching now isn't a story racing toward a conclusion. It's a process settling into place. A process where pressure no longer needs to rise because it's already everywhere. In memory, in comparison, in expectation. The documentary stops feeling like a film and starts feeling like a mirror. Every old moment reflects differently. Every past statement sounds altered. Not because the words change, but because the audience has. What once felt reassuring now feels incomplete. What once sounded confident now feels controlled. What once passed as maturity now feels like avoidance. And avoidance, once recognized, changes everything. This is where the long game begins to fail. The long game depended on patience turning into apathy, on attention drifting, on people deciding they'd heard enough. That hasn't happened. Instead, patience has turned into scrutiny. Viewers aren't waiting for new footage anymore. They're watching behavior, watching timing, watching who moves quickly and who suddenly needs distance, who keeps speaking and who retreats into carefully chosen silence. Every move becomes a response. Silence stops being empty. It becomes intentional. And intention is what the audience is reading now. This is where power usually relies on fatigue, on the assumption that curiosity will soften, that memory will fade, that time will smooth everything out. But time isn't doing that anymore. Time is stacking. Old interviews resurface and land differently. Old statements feel heavier. Casual remarks from years ago now sit under a harsher light. Not because new facts were added, but because context finally caught up. That shift can't be undone. The documentary doesn't chase a dramatic ending because it doesn't need one. Explosions fade, patterns don't. Patterns settle in slowly. They linger. They stay with you long after the screen goes dark. By now, the audience isn't asking whether something is true or false. They're asking why the same responses keep appearing across different decades. Why the same language shows up in unrelated situations. Why silence always arrives at the same moment clarity would have forced alignment. Those questions don't require answers to be effective. They only require repetition, and repetition is everywhere. You begin to see how narratives were rarely denied outright, just redirected. How responsibility was acknowledged in theory but never placed in practice. How accountability was discussed broadly while specifics stayed just out of reach. Nothing provable, nothing deniable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, repeated long enough, becomes a method. This is where the lens pulls back one last time, away from individuals, away from moments, toward the ecosystem itself, the friends who stayed quiet, the partners who kept doing business, the platforms that softened questions instead of sharpening them. What becomes impossible to ignore is that this was never just about protecting an image. It was about preserving a system. When scrutiny grew, attention was redirected. When pressure appeared, layers were added. When narratives became risky, distance was created. Not to erase the past, but to manage how it would be remembered. For years, that worked. But something has changed. The audience isn't reacting emotionally anymore. They're observing structurally, measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring what's said and what's avoided. Silence at this stage doesn't feel like restraint. It feels like choice. And once choice is visible, it can't hide behind time. That's why this story doesn't end here. It enters a different phase, one where every past decision is reread. Every relationship is re-examined. Every moment of silence is weighed against everything that came before it, quietly. Quiet scrutiny doesn't burn out. It doesn't need outrage to survive. It feeds on memory. And memory doesn't reset just because a new project launches or a new narrative is introduced. By the final moments, the takeaway isn't anger. It's clarity. Clarity about how power operates, how systems protect themselves, how influence moves quietly, how time was used not to heal, but to delay, and how delay only works until people stop forgetting. That's the point this story has reached. From here on, every statement will be compared. Every silence will be noticed. Every attempt to redirect will be measured against everything that came before it. Not emotionally, structurally. This doesn't end with a reveal. It doesn't end with a verdict. It ends with a shift where the narrative no longer belongs to the people trying to manage it. It belongs to memory, to comparison, to context. And once a story reaches that stage, it doesn't disappear. It waits. Because when memory becomes organized, silence loses its power. And when silence loses its power, the next move matters more than all the ones that came before it. That's where this ends. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently.